Hi, Personal Health. Welcome to Chapter 14, and we are talking about sexual health. And so, the elephant in the room is this is the most difficult conversation to have. And I'm sure you are more happy about having that conversation with me through a video camera than in the classroom. And that happens to be the case many times. But I want to tell you this is super important because these are things that we all are going to probably experience in our life. And it's very, very positive to have a solid personal value about what sexual health is and how you need to use it in your own life. So, to begin, I have three very unique questions, and I want you to go through these one at a time with me. First of all, you need to ask yourself, is sex a good or a bad thing? And what I mean by that is it inherently a good or bad thing? Many times we think of the word sex and it's automatic. We're kind of putting that out there that this is a place that we don't want to go and we don't want to talk about. And heaven forbid we actually have to talk about that with our parents or our loved ones or people that we really care about who are in a position or experiencing things that we know are just not good for them. And so I would tell you that in my own position, I believe that sex is a very good thing. I believe that it was created for us to enjoy. But one thing that we understand is that when it gets out of hand, it becomes a problem. And by that, what I'm saying is if you think about it, very similar to your fireplace in your home, and some of you have fireplaces in your home, but and some of you don't. But if you think about a fire inside that fireplace, that fire does a lot for a lot of people. It takes care of the warmth. It sets a nice tone to the home. And as long as that fire is kept within the fireplace, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. The problem is when that fire escapes the fireplace. And when it does, a lot of people suffer. And so sex is very much like that fire in the fireplace. And for our purposes, what I would tell you is that when it's between two consenting monogamous adults, preferably married, then it's a very, very beautiful thing. And it can be a beautiful thing for a very, very long time. And we're going to get into that here in a second. The problem is when it gets out of that, when other partners are brought into that, or it's just not controlled, it's not contained, and it's left to burn down the house, literally. And so that is what we're going to start our talk with. The second question is, I would have to ask you, did you receive a sex talk from your parents? And if you're a parent right now, you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, I haven't even thought about that. I'm going to have to do that. And I know for me personally, I have 4 children. And so, you know what? I got to do that 4 times. But I would also tell you that I did not get a good talk from my parents. And so when I consider what it was that I missed versus what I could have received, I'm very disappointed. And so I want to encourage you to think about what talk did you get? Because that is probably the most important place that sexual health education can occur, is between the people who love you the most. And so if that talk hasn't happened, and I'm not asking you to go back now and ask for that talk, because chances are you probably already know everything there is to know about it. But what I would say is that you don't know everything that you need to know about it, or that there is to know about it, because we rarely ever do. But the unique thing is we can still have those conversations and we can still improve our health and our knowledge and our awareness and our appreciation for keeping that fire within the fireplace. And then I would ask you to think about, what are things that would be good about having that talk now? What are ways that we can really have a healthy conversation about sexual health that would be helpful, that would be profound in our current life? And then the number 3 question is this: when will you be satisfied to no longer have a sexual life in your lifetime? Have you put an age limit on that yet? Is your 50s going to be that number? 60s? What about into your 7th and 8th decade? Will you still want a sexual life? And if so, how are you going to protect that so preciously that you can ensure that it's going to happen? And those are some unique thoughts, because I would probably imagine that you've not considered that. What are the things that we have to do now to protect our sex life in the future? Well, fortunately, we're going to have some unique things to talk about today, aren't we? And so, some things we have to do first is we have to understand what the risks are out there. And there are a lot of risks. First of all, when we consider what could happen between now and those later decades in our lives when we hope that we still are having sex, we have to consider that, you know what, it's a real possibility that I could do something now that could impede my sexual potential then. And so we give our first term to begin the term sexually transmitted infection. And that is simply an infection that is passed upon between two people when sexual contact occurs. Now, we have to really be careful here, because many times we say sexual contact and immediately intercourse is the only thing we think of to be sexual contact. But our book tells us that there are many ways that sexual contact can occur and cause infection. And I'm going to let you read through to see what those are, but they are not simply just intercourse. There are other pathways for infection to occur sexually. Number two is, what is unprotected sex? Well, that is any sex that there was not a condom used to protect with. And so if we are having unprotected sex, we are at big risk. And the only way we can have no risk is that third term there, and that is abstinence. That means you're not participating in sex. And some of you are like, wait a second, now that's getting a little intrusive here. But I'm telling you, if you want no risk, then you have no sex. And that is abstinence. And it is our best way to prevent from having any of the things that we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. So, next on our list, we have to understand that women and men have very common symptoms when a sexually transmitted infection is occurring. And these are not fun to talk about, but you need to be aware of what they are. Number one is that we see drippage occurring from any type of sex organ, whether that be male or female. Drippage occurs if there's sexually transmitted infection present. A number two one is there's burning of those sexual organs, there's itching of those sexual organs, and there's pain in those sexual organs. And if there's pain, there's typically not a lot of usage, right? Because if something hurts, you don't use it. That's like true if you sprain your ankle, you're not going to walk on it. So if you have pain from a sexually transmitted infection, you are not going to be having sex. And we've already discussed that it is very important to you to have sex for a very long time, right? So we go into this and we understand that these are the things that we see regardless if you're a male or a female in sexually transmitted infection. The next thing on our list is this right here, and that is, what type of sexually transmitted infections are there? Well, there are two categories. Number one is there's bacterial sexually transmitted infections, and number two, there is a viral sexually transmitted infection. And so the difference between the two are just simply this. A bacterial sexually transmitted infection can be treated with antibiotics. And so that is simply something that you can go to a doctor and get and take orally and probably clear this problem up. There are three specific ones we're going to talk about in this class. Number one is chlamydia. Chlamydia is by far the most common bacterial sexually transmitted infection. Number two is gonorrhea, and number three, syphilis. Now, some of you are like, now, wait a second, how do I know if one of those is occurring? Well, if you're sexually active, it could be occurring. Number two is, are any of these symptoms occurring from your sex organs? Because this is not for you to make the diagnosis on. This is for you to understand that these are things that could be happening. And so we go right back down here to this list, and we understand that these are the most common bacterial STIs. And then we look at the fact that they can be treated with antibiotics. And then we go in and we look at the viral STIs. And this is a very different situation, because these are not something that can be treated and cured. These are something that can be treated and we can kind of limit the symptoms on. But the reality is these are things that happen, and when they happen, you're living with these. And so yes, they are chronic in nature because they extend for months, years, and all we can do is kind of treat the symptoms. Number one on the list here is herpes. And you've probably heard of herpes before. Number two is the human papillomavirus. And HPV is very interesting because HPV is the leading cause of feminine cancers, specifically cervical. And so what we know is that if a female were to contract HPV and it becomes active, then the risk of cervical cancer is very much there. This is usually kind of talked about when we are thinking or having a conversation about genital warts, is HPV. The next one is hepatitis B, and there are 7 different types of hepatitis, and this is a focus on the liver and the inflammation of the liver, and this is just one type. There is a sexually transmitted type, and that is hepatitis B. And then the last thing is HIV and AIDS, and that kind of came up when I was growing up. Through the 80s and 90s, as a teenager, we heard a lot about AIDS, and we were all so scared that AIDS was going to kill and be apocalyptic in its nature that nobody wanted to have sex because it was scary. But now what we know is that we got it under control, and at least to a point. But there are certain risks associated with the whole idea of HIV and AIDS. And so there's some stats that I want to share with you about what we know occurs with our high risk behaviors. And so the first one is on page 454. We understand that these risks are there and what those risks are. And that, first of all, is any type of sexual contact. It does not matter what kind it is other than intercourse, because intercourse is not the only kind out there. And so we can have STIs occur from any type of sexually transmitted contact or sexual contact. So the biggest thing is what is unprotected sex? Again, that is not using any type of protection like latex condoms. And so with that, we have to understand that there are other risks out there, because when people have unprotected sex, they're more likely to do other risky behaviors. And I'm not saying that just because you've had unprotected sex that you're a risky person who would share needles, but we know that those two things kind of could be a risk together. And so we talked about substance abuse in the last chapter. I'm not going to go back into that, but sharing needles gives us blood-to-blood contact, and therefore we have to include it here as a high-risk behavior. But casual partners, that is one thing that we know does associate with people who are ready to have unprotected sex, that they're also ready to have it with a lot of people. And that is one thing that we know is a very quick way to contract a sexually transmitted infection. Avoiding injury during sex, and I'm sure some of you read this and thought, holy moly, how could that even happen? I want to tell you, as a healthcare provider and someone who's worked in the private hospital sector, it happens. And we're just going to leave it at that. Number 6 on our list here is drinking responsibly. So we're integrating this behavior of using responsible drinking. Why? Because if you don't drink responsibly, you make poor choices. And a lot of times that could lead to unprotected sex, multiple sex partners, and STI. And so you see how these things are linked. And again, my question from the top: how long do you want to have sex in your life? Well, if you want to have sex deep into your 70s and 80s and 90s and however long you live, then I would tell you that to do that, you need to imagine what or not imagine, but you need to put down on paper and follow it. What are your own self-discipline rules for having sex now? Hopefully they include the opposite of these things right here. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. Obviously, you can always call or come by the office. Hope everything's going well for you. See you soon.